travellers. We want to talk about today is these are Chinese residents in Australia on a visa. Now it may be a long-term residence visa, it could be a business visa, but we're talking about Chinese residents here in Australia. I have two Chinese phrases for this, so I apologise in advance if I try to pronounce them and it's incorrect or I'm saying something inappropriate. Brought to it by the research company. The research suggests there's some opportunities, and what we wanted to put forward was a concept that potentially we could actually use the domestic market for Chinese visitors in Australia in some kind of rapid prototyping. So the expense, etc., of actually going to China may not absolutely be necessary. There may be the opportunity in some cases, not all cases, in some cases, but we need to actually test this in rapid prototyping. They were heavily influenced by the perceptions that they brought to Australia from China. So whatever they'd actually learned there and what they were bringing to the country, that's actually what kicked them off. During their first 2 years, however, it was this concept of the best of. During the first 2 years that they're here in Australia, very much in the front of their mind is they want to do what is the best of Australia. Now, the language is still a barrier to a degree. Regardless of demographics, they still want to look at a tour group from that point of view. But it's very much the best of. So it's the things they consider to be what is the best in this particular market. The next group were those who are here for 2 to 3 years. And here we start to see their view start to deteriorate a little. It's now not so much the best of. It's talking about the depth of the actual market. And we just talked about the previous speaker was just talking about something different, something a little new. Now they're actually moving more experiential. They're moving more towards mainstream domestic tourism, but they're more experiential. It's more attractive to the younger market that's living and working in Australia. Don't forget this covers workers as well. And they're seeking more adventure and potentially more self-directed holidays. But to this particular point, they're saying, I still want to see there's a depth here that I want to actually see within Australia. Interestingly, once they cross the 2-year mark, they actually start to revert to type. They actually become more Australian in their tastes and what they're actually looking for. And given the propensity for Australians currently for outbound travel, Chinese residents who've been resident in Australia for 2 years or more start to tend to look back overseas, whether it be China or elsewhere, for some of these differences, some of these experiences that they're looking for to test themselves. Where? Okay, so the first one was the must-see landmarks in Australia. This is this best of. There are some things that come to Australia and say, these are the things that we must see. The people that we spoke to talked about the big three, which is literally how they spoke about it in Chinese. The big rock, the big road, and the big reef. I hope they're all pretty obvious. The rock, obviously, at Ayers Rock. The big road was the Great Ocean Road. The reef, obviously, being the Great Barrier Reef. Interestingly, from a Queensland point of view, from the Great Barrier Reef, they saw that not just as a best of and as a must-do from a Queensland or Australia visitation, they saw it as a global. This was one of the absolute bucket lists that they needed to tick off on a global basis. But this is where it started to move apart, and this is where we started to see some real information. What they were looking for beyond that was things that were unique or remarkably different from their life in China. So this is the place, importantly, places they associated with fresh air, rainforests, etc. Uncrowded places, we'll talk about this, a qualification around this in the next slide, but they were looking for uncrowded places. They weren't looking for too many touristy areas per se. Large-scale natural wonders, obviously, and landmarks that haven't been artificially developed by man as such, which I can see a lot of those back in China. So looking for more natural type experiences. So where? Okay, so most intend to holiday in Australia at some point in the next 2 years, okay, which is a positive thing. The way that we looked at it was, well, okay, if we're turning them over 2 years and they start to revert to type, then that means every 2 years we've almost got a new market that we can work with and particularly we can prototype with. So Queensland came out on top, which was good news. Sorry to everybody else. 55% was their preferred state. Victorians 44, Tasmania 41. Sorry to the New South Welshmen, but I only went that far because I figured we got to Tas, we didn't need to go any further. Destinations within Queensland that they were interested in. The Gold Coast was a bolter on 85%. Now Brisbane was next, but not Brisbane as we necessarily know it as a destination, but Brisbane CBD. Now the thing was they saw it as a secondary and an easily saleable secondary destination in association with the Gold Coast. They loved that juxtaposition of the two of them side by side. The Sunshine Coast, 45%. Thought I'd throw that in there for you there, Simon. Predominantly, though, Chinese residents living in Queensland. That was where that figure was actually came from. But interestingly, although they knew the destinations they wanted to go to, there was a very limited product knowledge outside of the Great Barrier Reef and the Gold Coast, and I'm talking about the Greater Gold Coast per se. So why? Well, they wanted to cross off their bucket list. They have these must-dos that they want to cross off, and they were very important for them to be able to cross them off that list. But here's where it gets interesting again. The whole idea of the ideal holiday, or the ideal Queensland holiday for Chinese people living in Australia, where the drivers were being with their family, they were looking for the well-known landmarks, but importantly, the more the better. There's a value component to that, but it was more just, I want to get this done, I want to see this now. Foreign cuisine mixed with Chinese food, fresh local produce was unique to the destination, mild weather. But here's this thing again about number of people at the destination, except this time they were very specific. They didn't want to particularly be where there were a lot of other Chinese tourists. And they were nature orientated, preferably the big scale, big production, wow factor type nature. Now, interestingly, and once again just referring back briefly to Kestel from the previous speech, this is very, very similar for the younger market, but they wanted that edge. They wanted that bit of adventure on the side as well. And that is what the domestic market looks like as far as the Chinese business in Australia is concerned.
Queensland shines on me, where it shines. Queensland shines on me, where Australia shines.